What happens when one of Hollywood's most recognizable actors walks onto one of daytime television's most outspoken panels expecting a friendly conversation, and instead finds himself pushed into a tense exchange that slowly turns into one of the most talked-about moments the show has seen all season? Make sure to subscribe to Talk Show Fallout and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The cameras are already rolling as the familiar theme music from The View fades out and the audience finishes applauding. Around the table, the hosts settle in with their coffee mugs, and the mood feels relaxed at first. It's the kind of opening that viewers of the show are used to: casual, conversational, and a little bit unpredictable. At the center of the panel sits longtime moderator Whoopi Goldberg, flipping through her note cards while smiling toward the audience. "All right," Whoopi says with a light laugh. "Our next guest is someone you all definitely know." The audience cheers even before she finishes the introduction. He's starred in everything from big action films to comedy favorites, and now he's here to talk about his latest project. Please welcome Chris Pratt. Chris walks out to loud applause, waving to the crowd as he approaches the table. He shakes hands with Whoopi and the rest of the hosts before taking his seat. "Thanks for having me," he says, still smiling as the applause fades. "You've been busy," Whoopi replies. "Every time we turn around, you're in another movie." Chris chuckles. "Well, that's the goal, right?" The audience laughs softly. Another host leans forward. "But seriously, you've had this incredible run. Action movies, animated films, comedy. You've kind of done it all." Chris nods. "I've been very lucky." For the first few minutes, the conversation stays easy. They talk about filming schedules, how Chris balances work and family, and how strange it can be to suddenly see yourself everywhere. One of the hosts jokes, "Do your kids think you're cool yet?" Chris laughs. "Not even a little bit." The audience laughs with him. But slowly, the conversation begins to shift, the way it sometimes does on The View when the panel moves from entertainment into broader topics. Whoopi glances down at her card again. "So," she says carefully, "something that comes up a lot when people talk about you online is, well, the way you've been pretty open about your personal beliefs." Chris nods politely, though his expression tightens just slightly. "Sure." Whoopi continues. "And there's been a lot of discussion about celebrities speaking out on social issues. Some people say it's important. Others say maybe actors should just stick to acting." A murmur runs through the audience. Chris shifts in his seat, still calm. "Yeah, I've seen those conversations." Another host jumps in. "And sometimes," she adds, "when celebrities talk about their faith or personal values, people feel like it can send a message to fans, especially younger fans." Chris listens carefully, hands folded on the table. "I think everyone's entitled to their beliefs," he says. "That's kind of the point of living in a free society." There's a small round of applause from the audience. Whoopi nods slowly. "That's true," she says. "But there are also people who feel that when someone with a huge platform speaks about those beliefs, it carries influence." Chris nods again. "Of course." For a moment, the conversation pauses, the kind of brief silence that live television sometimes produces when both sides are deciding how far they want to go. Then Whoopi leans forward slightly. "But let me ask you something," she says, "because this is something viewers ask us about a lot." Chris looks directly at her. "Okay, do you think celebrities have a responsibility to be careful about the messages they send, especially when those messages are connected to religion or politics?" The audience grows quiet. Chris takes a second before answering. "I think celebrities are just people," he says calmly. "We're actors. We're not experts on everything." One host nods. "That's fair." Chris continues. "But I also think people sometimes assume things about you that aren't necessarily true." Whoopi tilts her head slightly. "What do you mean by that?" Chris gives a small shrug. "Well," he says, "there are stories online where people say, 'Chris Pratt believes this,' or 'Chris Pratt supports that.' And half the time I'm reading it thinking, where did that even come from?" A few people in the audience laugh. Another host smiles. "Welcome to the internet." Chris laughs lightly. "Exactly." But Whoopi doesn't laugh. Instead, she leans back in her chair, studying him. "Well," she says slowly, "sometimes people get those impressions from things you choose to associate with." There's a slight shift in the room. Chris notices it. "What do you mean?" he asks. Whoopi glances toward the other hosts before continuing. "I mean the organizations you support, the events you attend, the statements you make, even if they seem small." Chris nods, still composed. "Sure. And when fans see that," Whoopi adds, Some of them start asking questions. Chris smiles politely, but now his tone becomes a little more serious. I understand that. One of the co-hosts jumps in, sensing the tension. And I think what people are really asking is, do you ever worry about how those perceptions affect your audience? Chris pauses again. Well, he says slowly, I worry more about being honest. The audience reacts quietly. Because if you spend your whole life trying to shape how strangers interpret everything you do, he continues, you'll drive yourself crazy. A few audience members clap. Whoopi watches him carefully. But honesty can also be complicated, she says. Chris nods. It can be. Whoopi folds her hands on the table. Because sometimes, she continues, what feels honest to one person can feel harmful to someone else. The audience murmurs again. Chris leans slightly forward now. I agree with that, he says. But I also think assuming the worst about people you don't actually know, that's not very fair either. The room goes quiet. One of the hosts raises her eyebrows. Whoopi looks directly at him. Are you saying people have assumed the worst about you? Chris doesn't hesitate this time. Yeah, he says simply. There's a ripple of reaction from the crowd. Another host tries to lighten the mood. Well, social media can be brutal. Chris chuckles softly. That's putting it nicely. But Whoopi isn't backing off. Still, she says, some critics say you've avoided addressing those concerns directly. Chris turns toward her again. Or maybe, he replies calmly, I just didn't think every rumor on the internet deserved a press conference. The audience reacts with a louder mix of laughter and applause. One of the co-hosts lets out a surprised, oh. Whoopi raises her eyebrows. All right, she says slowly. That's one way to look at it. Chris smiles slightly. I'm just being honest. For a moment, nobody speaks. And that's when the tone of the interview begins to change. The friendly promotional segment that started with jokes and applause now feels like something else entirely. One host glances between Whoopi and Chris. Well, this got interesting. The audience laughs nervously. Whoopi leans forward again, resting her arms on the table. Okay, she says. Then let's talk about it. The room goes quiet. Chris looks at her, still composed. All right. Whoopi taps her card lightly against the table. Because if we're going to have an honest conversation, she says, we might as well have the whole conversation. The audience senses what's coming. And suddenly, what started as a routine interview is about to become something much more intense. The room stays quiet for a moment after Whoopi Goldberg says that. You can almost feel the shift in the air. Just a few minutes earlier, everyone was laughing about movie roles and family life. But now the tone at the table has clearly changed. Chris Pratt notices it too. He sits a little straighter in his chair, still calm, still polite, but now clearly paying close attention. Whoopi glances around the table, and then back at him. You said something interesting a moment ago, she says. You said people assume the worst about you online. Chris nods slightly. Yeah, so let's talk about that, she continues. Because there are viewers who feel like when celebrities stay quiet about certain issues, that silence can send a message too. The audience murmurs softly. Chris takes a breath before answering. I understand why people feel that way, he says. But I also think sometimes people expect actors to comment on absolutely everything. One of the co-hosts leans in. Well, when you have millions of followers, she says, people do expect you to use that platform. Chris nods again. That's fair. Another host jumps in. But some fans feel like you only speak up when it's comfortable, she says carefully. There's a noticeable reaction from the audience. Chris raises his eyebrows slightly, but he doesn't get defensive. What do you mean by comfortable? He asks. The host gestures lightly. Well, you talk about family, faith, positivity, things like that. But when certain social issues come up, people notice when someone with your reach stays quiet. Chris pauses for a moment, clearly choosing his words. I think there's a difference between staying quiet and choosing not to turn your life into a political press conference, he says. A few audience members clap. But Whoopi isn't finished. See, here's where people struggle with that, she says, leaning forward. Because fans look at celebrities they admire and they think, if this person believes something strongly, why not say it? Chris looks at her calmly. Sometimes because the conversation online isn't actually a conversation. That line gets a louder reaction from the audience. Whoopi tilts her head. What do you mean? Chris gives a small shrug. You know what I mean, he says. Most of the time, it's not about understanding someone. It's about trying to trap them into saying the wrong thing. One of the hosts laughs nervously. Well, that does happen. Chris continues. I've watched it happen to a lot of people. One sentence gets clipped, taken out of context, and suddenly that's the headline. Whoopi nods slowly, but she pushes back. But some people would say that's the price of being a public figure. Chris nods. Sure. So why not just clarify things when the criticism comes? She asks. Chris leans back slightly, thinking. Because sometimes responding actually makes it worse, he says. The audience murmurs again. Another co-host speaks up. But don't you think ignoring it lets other people control the narrative about you? Chris smiles faintly. They already do. That line gets a noticeable laugh from the crowd. Whoopi folds her hands. Okay, she says. But let's be real for a moment. Chris nods. Okay. There are people who feel hurt by things connected to organizations you've been associated with, she says carefully. And when they don't hear a response from you, they feel like maybe you agree with those positions. The room becomes noticeably quiet again. Chris looks thoughtful now. Well, first, he says, I think it's important not to assume someone's entire belief system based on a headline. Some audience members clap. Whoopi raises an eyebrow. But headlines don't come out of nowhere, she replies. Chris nods. That's true. Another host tries to clarify. I think what Whoopi's saying is that when you're someone people admire, your silence can feel like an answer. Chris looks at her. I hear that. There's a pause. Then Chris leans slightly forward. But I also think there's something happening in our culture right now where people want to sort everyone into teams, he says. The audience reacts with a few murmurs of agreement. And the moment you don't say exactly what someone expects, he continues, they decide you must be on the other side. Whoopi listens closely. That's not entirely wrong, she admits. Chris smiles slightly. But it's also not entirely right. A small wave of applause comes from the audience. Another host laughs quietly. This is getting philosophical. Chris chuckles. I didn't expect a philosophy debate this morning either. The audience laughs. But Whoopi leans forward again. Let me ask you something directly then, she says. Chris nods. Go ahead. Do you understand why some fans feel disappointed when celebrities they like won't clearly state where they stand? Chris pauses for a few seconds before answering. Yeah, he says honestly. I do. That answer surprises a few people in the audience. But here's the thing, he continues. People think that if you say the right sentence, the criticism stops. One of the hosts laughs knowingly. That is not how the internet works. Exactly, Chris replies. The audience laughs again. So instead, he continues, I try to focus on how I treat people in real life. Whoopi nods slowly. That matters. Chris continues calmly. I've worked with people from every background you can imagine. Different cultures, different beliefs, different lifestyles. Another host adds, Hollywood definitely has all of that. Chris smiles. And the truth is, most people get along. Just fine when they're actually talking face to face. That line gets another round of applause. But Whoopi isn't letting the tension disappear entirely. Still, she says, there are people who say that sounds like avoiding the bigger conversation. Chris looks directly at her now. I don't think treating people with respect is avoiding anything. The audience reacts with louder applause. One of the hosts raises her hand slightly. Okay. Whoopi smiles a little now, though the debate energy is still there. You're good at this, she says. Chris laughs. No, I'm just trying to answer honestly. Another host chimes in. But do you see why people wanted you to respond when those stories were trending? Chris nods. I do. And, Chris shrugs slightly. And I decided that arguing with millions of strangers online probably wasn't going to help anyone. That gets a big laugh from the audience. Whoopi smiles despite herself. Well, you're not wrong about that. Chris grins. Finally, something we agree on. The audience laughs again. But then Whoopi adds something that shifts the tone once more. Still, she says slowly, some people believe silence protects power. The audience murmurs. Chris's expression becomes serious again. What do you mean by that? He asks. Whoopi looks straight at him. I mean, sometimes people with influence stay quiet because speaking honestly might upset their audience. The table goes still. One of the co-hosts quietly says, Oh boy. Chris looks at Whoopi for a moment. Then he leans forward slightly. So you think I'm protecting my audience? Whoopi shrugs lightly. I'm asking the question. The tension at the table is now unmistakable. Chris pauses. Then he smiles, though this time there's a firmness behind it. Well, he says calmly, if we're asking honest questions, the audience leans in. Then maybe we should also ask why celebrities are expected to pass every ideological test before they're allowed to just be actors. A loud reaction ripples through the crowd. Some applause, some surprised laughter. One of the hosts covers her mouth in shock. Whoopi raises her eyebrows. All right, she says slowly. The debate has officially arrived. And everyone at the table, and in the audience, can feel that the conversation is about to get even more intense. The audience reaction lingers for a few seconds after Chris Pratt says that. Some people clap, others laugh in surprise, and a few just sit there watching closely. It's the kind of moment where everyone realizes the conversation has officially crossed from a routine interview into a real debate. At the center of the table, Whoopi Goldberg leans back in her chair for a moment, studying him. Well, she says slowly, that's a strong way to put it. Chris shrugs lightly, though his tone stays calm. I'm not trying to make it dramatic, he says. I'm just saying what a lot of people in my industry are thinking. One of the co-hosts raises her eyebrows. You think other actors feel that way too? Chris laughs quietly. I know they do, he replies. The audience reacts with a few chuckles. Another host jumps in. But some would argue that nobody is forcing celebrities to take those tests, she says. People are just reacting to what they see. Chris nods. That's true, he says. But there's a difference between reacting and demanding. The audience murmurs again. Whoopi folds her hands together. So you feel like people are demanding something from you? Chris takes a breath. Sometimes, yeah. One of the hosts tilts her head. What exactly? Chris looks around the table before answering. They want you to confirm that you believe exactly what they believe, he says. That line gets a noticeable reaction from the crowd. And if you don't? Whoopi asks. Chris smiles slightly. Well, then suddenly you're the villain. A few audience members laugh nervously. Whoopi nods slowly. But that's also the risk of being a public figure, she says. Chris doesn't disagree. Sure. He pauses, then adds something that shifts the tone again. But here's the thing people don't always realize. The audience quiets. A lot of actors avoid these conversations not because they're hiding something, he says, but because they know no answer will actually satisfy everyone. One of the co-hosts nods reluctantly. That's probably true. Another host jumps in. But don't you think avoiding it can sometimes make people assume the worst? Chris nods again. Absolutely. And you're okay with that? She asks. Chris shrugs. I'm okay with people having opinions about me, he says. What I'm not okay with is the idea that I owe the internet a full explanation of my personal beliefs. That line draws louder applause from part of the audience. One of the hosts laughs. You just gave the internet another headline. Chris laughs too. Probably. But Whoopi leans forward again. Let me push back on that a little, she says. Chris nods. Go ahead. You said earlier that people try to sort everyone into teams, she continues. But sometimes those teams are built around real issues that affect real people. The audience murmurs in agreement. Chris listens carefully. I agree with that, he says. So when people want clarity from someone with your platform, Whoopi adds, it's not always about ideology. Sometimes it's about knowing whether someone they admire actually supports them. Chris thinks about that for a moment. That's a fair point, he says. The audience reacts softly, some surprised by the acknowledgement. One of the hosts smiles. Well, that sounded like progress. Chris chuckles. I'm not here to fight with anyone. Whoopi smiles slightly. But you did just say celebrities are expected to pass ideological tests. Chris nods. I did. And you stand by that? Chris leans forward slightly now, his tone still measured but more direct. Yeah, he says. Because I've seen how it works. The room goes quiet again. You make one comment, he continues. Or you don't make a comment. And suddenly thousands of people who have never met you decide exactly who you are. A few audience members clap. Another host adds, social media does move fast. Chris laughs. Fast is one word for it. Then he says something that makes the audience react immediately. Sometimes it feels like people are less interested in conversation and more interested in catching someone slipping. A wave of applause spreads across the crowd. Whoopi raises an eyebrow. You think people are waiting for celebrities to mess up? Chris doesn't hesitate. Absolutely. One of the co-hosts laughs. He's not wrong. Whoopi looks toward the audience and then back. At Chris. But some people would say accountability isn't the same thing as waiting for someone to mess up. Chris nods. That's true. So where's the line? She asks. Chris pauses for a moment. That's the hard part, he admits. The audience grows quiet again. Because accountability is important, he continues. But so is assuming good intentions. That line gets another round of applause. One of the hosts nods. Those two things don't always exist at the same time online. Chris smiles. Exactly. Whoopi studies him for a moment before speaking again. You're being very diplomatic right now. Chris laughs. I'm trying. The audience laughs with him. But I'm still curious about something, Whoopi says. Okay, you said earlier people assume things about you that aren't true. Chris nods. Yeah, so let me ask you directly, she says. Do those assumptions bother you? Chris pauses again. Then he answers honestly. Sometimes. The audience quiets. Not because they hurt my feelings, he adds, but because I know people who believe those stories are forming opinions about someone they've never actually talked to. One host nods slowly. That's fair. Chris continues. And the truth is, if most of those people sat down with me in real life, we'd probably get along just fine. A few audience members clap. Whoopi smiles slightly. That might be true. Chris smiles back. But online, everything gets turned into a battle. Another host laughs. That's basically the internet. Chris nods. Exactly. Then Whoopi says something that brings the tension back again. But Chris, she says, some critics feel like when you talk about being misunderstood, you're dismissing the concerns people actually have. The room becomes quiet again. Chris looks at her thoughtfully. I'm not dismissing anyone's concerns, he says. Then what are you doing? She asks. Chris leans forward, speaking a little more firmly now. I'm saying that disagreement doesn't automatically mean someone is a bad person. A loud wave of applause spreads through the audience. One of the hosts raises her eyebrows. Okay, Whoopi nods slowly. That's a conversation a lot of people are having right now. Chris smiles slightly. Maybe we should have more of them like this. The audience laughs. Another host looks at both of them. Well, I'll say one thing. What's that? Chris asks. This interview is definitely not going the way we expected. Everyone laughs, even Whoopi. But the tension is still there. And it's clear the conversation is heading toward its most intense moment yet. For a moment after that comment, the table goes quiet again. The audience at the View is still reacting, some clapping, some laughing softly, others just watching the exchange carefully. What started as a casual interview has clearly turned into something much bigger. At the center of the table, Whoopi Goldberg exhales and leans back slightly in her chair. Well, she says with a small smile, this turned into a whole morning conversation. The audience laughs. Across from her, Chris Pratt smiles too, though he still looks thoughtful. I didn't plan to come in here and start a debate, he says. One of the co-hosts laughs. Too late for that. More laughter from the crowd. Another host shakes her head playfully. I think the internet is already writing the headlines. Chris chuckles. That's what I was afraid of. The audience laughs again. But Whoopi leans forward once more, bringing the tone back to something more reflective. You know, she says, I actually appreciate you being willing to sit here and have the conversation. Chris nods. I appreciate you asking the questions. There's a short round of applause from the audience. Another host jumps in. Because let's be honest, a lot of interviews stay very surface level. Movie promotion, a few jokes, and then that's it. Chris nods. Yeah, but this is the kind of conversation viewers actually talk about afterward, she adds. The audience murmurs in agreement. Whoopi looks at Chris again. Before we wrap up, I want to ask one more thing. Chris nods. Sure. You talked about people making assumptions online, she says. So if you could say something directly to viewers who may have formed those opinions about you, what would you say? The room gets quiet again. Chris thinks for a moment before answering. I'd say try not to reduce people to a headline. The audience reacts softly. Because nobody's life fits into a tweet, he continues. A few people clap. And the truth is, most of us are more complicated than the internet makes us look. Whoopi nods slowly. That's true. Another host adds, especially actors. Chris laughs. Especially actors. Then he adds something that gets another reaction from the crowd. I also think we'd all be better off if we talked to people we disagree with instead of immediately assuming the worst about them. The audience applauds louder this time. Whoopi smiles. That's a pretty good message. Chris shrugs. It's a simple one. One of the hosts glances toward the audience. And judging by that applause, a lot of people here agree. The audience cheers lightly. But Whoopi adds one last thought. You know, she says, I think part of the reason conversations like this get heated is because people care about these issues. Chris nods. That's fair. And caring isn't the problem, she continues. It's how we talk to each other when we disagree. Chris smiles slightly. Exactly. The tension that filled the table earlier now feels different. Less like an argument and more like a real conversation that simply got intense. One of the hosts laughs. I have to say, this might be the most philosophical interview we've had in a while. The audience laughs. Chris smiles. I'll try to bring more explosions next time to balance it out. That gets a big laugh. Whoopi points at him jokingly. See, now that's the movie star answer we expected. Everyone laughs again, including Chris. As the moment winds down, the producer's voice can be faintly heard off camera, letting the hosts know they're almost out of time. Whoopi glances toward the camera. Well, Chris, thank you for coming in. Chris nods. Thanks for having me. Another host adds. And thank you for not running away halfway through the interview. Chris laughs. I thought about it. The audience erupts in laughter. Whoopi shakes her head. No, you didn't. Chris grins. No, I didn't. The audience applauds again as the conversation shifts back to the lighter tone typical of the show's closing moments. But even as the segment ends, it's obvious everyone in the room knows something. Memorable just happened. The cameras cut to a commercial break. And almost immediately, the moment begins spreading online. Clips from the exchange between Chris Pratt and Whoopi Goldberg start appearing across social media platforms. Viewers begin posting short video clips with captions like, Chris Pratt fires back on live TV. Unexpected debate on The View this morning. Did Chris Pratt just challenge the whole celebrity narrative? Within minutes, the comment sections fill up. Some viewers praise Chris for staying calm during the discussion. Others say Whoopi asked the questions many people were thinking. Some comments read, finally a celebrity willing to push back. Another viewer writes, Whoopi handled that conversation exactly how a host should. Others simply say, that interview got intense fast. By the time the show finishes airing, the conversation is trending across entertainment pages and discussion forums. Entertainment blogs begin writing headlines analyzing the exchange. Some describe it as a tense but respectful debate. Others call it one of the most unexpectedly honest interviews the show has had this season. Later that afternoon, panel discussions online start breaking down the moment, debating whether Chris's comments were a defense of personal privacy or a criticism of celebrity culture. Backstage at The View, the mood is reportedly much calmer than viewers might expect. Sources say Chris chatted briefly with the hosts after the segment ended. No shouting. No drama. Just a few laughs and some mutual respect after a heated conversation. Which, in many ways, is exactly what daytime talk shows are supposed to do. Create conversations people keep talking about long after the cameras stop rolling. And judging by the reaction online, this is definitely one viewers won't forget anytime soon. If you watch this moment, we want to hear from you. Do you think Chris Pratt handled the debate well? Or do you think Whoopi Goldberg asked the tough questions that needed to be asked? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Talk Show Fallout for more real talk show stories.